Good evening. It is a great joy to be with you tonight. Always refreshing to be able to assemble with the Lord's people. Particularly that's true on Wednesday nights. Just wish on this particular Wednesday night I wasn't so sleep deprived. But I will say it's a good kind of tired to have at the moment. My sweet baby girl this morning when she went into the hospital seemed to be in good spirits. And I mention that because last couple of weeks she's been really anxious, knowing that she's going to have major surgery today and have this baby removed through C-section. And so she'd been dreading it and worried about it, and of course been asking and coveting everyone's prayers. And this morning I thought, well, it's interesting because her mindset and her attitude was just so different, and she seemed relieved almost. And then the surgery was a success, and the baby is beautiful, is perfect, in fact, and I can't find any flaw with him. And so we're very thankful to have little James Matthew in our little clan now, in my neck of the woods. But when Lydia was through with the surgery, she was talking to us in her room, and she said, I think all these prayers have really made the difference with me and my state of mind. And I know that all these prayers have been mentioned on my behalf have certainly helped me through this ordeal. And I wanted to mention that to you because it meant a great deal to me to hear her say that. And I will also ask you to bear with me a little bit tonight. I'm not exaggerating and I'm not kidding when I say I haven't slept in more than 24 hours. And so if I say something crazy or off the wall, or if I say something that sounds like the opposite of what I meant to say, then you know what I meant to say, because I didn't mean to say if it comes out crazy. That's not what I intended. I would like to kind of pick back up where we left off just a couple of weeks ago. And I appreciate my father standing in for me. Summer series is over now, and so we can now get back into earnest in our study of the book of Genesis, and I'm very pleased that we're able to do that. A couple of weeks ago, we had just studied the first two chapters, or read over. We hadn't really studied extensively, but had read over the first two chapters of Genesis. And we were talking about the fact that there are two world views. This is something that most people, the average person on the street, is not aware of. Now, they hear it talked about in different ways. Sometimes in the political arena, for example, you hear people talk about liberal and conservative. Now, I'll grant you, in this worldview that I'm discussing tonight, there is some crossover between conservative and liberal, if we use that term very broadly in the political sense. But if we're speaking strictly conservative and liberal, it's very difficult to imagine anyone with a Christian worldview in the liberal camp. Although I'm not saying it's not possible, some people are still there because they don't realize that they don't belong there. They're still in that camp, not realizing what they're doing there. But there are two very different worldviews. We sometimes hear politicians say we have two different Americas, and that's true. What that means is that whenever you approach anything in life, any subject, any problem, any issue, you're going to filter that situation in your mind through your worldview. And when I speak of two different worldviews, I'm simply saying there are those who believe in God. That God made the world, that He made mankind, that He gave us His plan, He gave us His word, and so we live our lives accordingly. Decisions are based on what God's word says, for example, and what we think God would think about a certain thing, or how God might judge us for a certain thing. There are others, however, that do not believe this, or if they do, they're not certain they believe this. They kind of maybe half-heartedly believe it. They're not really convinced one way or the other. They would like to believe there's a God, but they hear all of this talk about scientific evidence pointing to natural selection and Darwin and biological evolution. And they have this idea painted for them in their minds, and it's actually been a very good propaganda campaign by our enemy to convince most people in this country that science is on the side of Darwinian evolution. And if you don't believe in Darwin's evolutionary model, then you're just trying to deny reality. You're trying to deny real science. The point we were making a couple of weeks ago is that there's not really much at all about Darwinian-style evolution that is even remotely scientific, as that term is defined, and we define it in this class. How would you, let me, before I continue this lecture, how many of you would remember in brief, just using your own words, what is science? What is a scientific inquiry into anything? What measures do we take? How would you define it and describe it for the class? Science. What is it? It's what? It's measurable, it's observable, it's something we can do with empirical senses. We can measure it, we can test it over and over again, and hopefully get the same results. If we don't get the same results, we have to recheck our theory, but nevertheless, it is a scientific inquiry that involves facts. Now, there are worldviews and philosophies that are not really part of science. And I'm going to say this very carefully, but the creation worldview is not necessarily a scientific worldview. It is a philosophical worldview. It is based, I believe, in science. It is supported by science, yes. By the same token, Darwinian evolution is not based in scientific fact. It is a philosophical approach to the origin of things. I do not believe, and we're going to try to substantiate this in class, I do not believe that Darwinian evolution is supported by scientific inquiry. And that's really the crux of the matter. And I think that's what throws people off, because they hear me say something like that and they think, well, you just don't know the facts. You just don't know reality. Everybody knows, you've heard that expression used many times, everybody knows, and you fill in the blank. In this case, everybody knows that we evolved from simple life forms over billions of years. Now, if you take that worldview, certain consequences will follow. For example, when it comes to moral questions, how do we determine the rightness or wrongness of something? How do you know that something is right? You say, well, it's right for me, may not be right for you. That's absurd. Because at the end of the day, what may be right for me is to kill you, to take your life, maybe to eat you, because people do that. I know it's horrible. You think that's terrible, but there are people that do that. There are cultures, in fact, that do that. Whole cultures. You say, well, they shouldn't do that. Well, let me ask you this question. Why shouldn't they? Who's to say they shouldn't do that? Who's to say that's wrong or that's bad? So everything comes down to our worldview, whether we recognize it or not. How we view economics, how we view science, how we view family matters. All of these things are colored by our worldview. So when we get back to where we were a couple of weeks ago, we remember that the evolutionist, to make his great claim for the evolution of life from simple amoeba, simple life forms, into what we now know as ourselves, having this discussion about where we came from. If you go back to where we were a couple of weeks ago, the evolutionist, we were saying, is relying upon time. In fact, they will come right out and say, time performs miracles. And so they literally have replaced God with time, inconceivable amounts of time. I remember when I was a kid in school, it was like 2.5, 3 billion years ago, the earth was formed, and of course evolution began sometime thereafter. Now it's like 4.5 to 5 billion. But then, of course, that's just for the earth. Then we have the solar system and the galaxy and all these other things that have formed over billions of years. And so we're now up to around 15 billion years, going back to the original so-called Big Bang. So time just keeps getting thrown in there. And of course, you may be like me. Even if I were in that camp and I did believe in Darwinian evolution, I'm curious enough to know, how could anybody figure that out? How would you know anything beyond, a couple of millennia? I mean, it's just hard to know scientifically. I'm sure there's some way to measure it. But how would you know anything in the billions of realm? And yet we're told constantly scientists have dated this, and they can say pretty securely that this is so many billion. And so we hear that over and over and over again, and we begin to think, well, man, this earth has been around a long, long time. And when you read the Bible, and you put all the dates together in the Bible, you don't come with anything even close to that. Not a billion years, not a million years, not even 10,000 years can be found in the Bible. Now, you might come close to 10, depending on how you date certain things and how you understand certain texts, and there is room for debate. But we're not going to get anywhere past 10,000 years. So there's a huge difference in our understanding of these facts. So let's just begin tonight asking this question. Is the claim by the evolutionists for great age of the earth based upon solid scientific evidence, or is it grounded upon evolutionary assumptions? Are we just assuming Darwin was right, and so to make Darwinism work, well, then we're going to have to come up with eons of time, and we can just do that by literally fabricating and making things up, which I think we'll see is the case. Dr. Stephen Morbath, an evolutionist associated with the University of Oxford, had this to say: no terrestrial rocks closely approaching an age of 4.6 billion years have yet been discovered. The evidence for the age of the earth is circumstantial, being based upon indirect reasoning. Well, what kind of reasoning says that the earth is 4.6 billion years? We're looking for scientific evidence. And it seemed to me that Dr. Morbath is pretty much saying we just believe it's 4.6 billion years old. And we want to believe that. We need that amount of time in order to pull off what we're trying to pull off. Dr. John Eddy, an evolutionary astronomer, said there's no evidence. What is one of the hallmarks of science? Empirical evidence. There is no evidence based solely on solar observations that the sun is 4.5 to 5 billion. Well, okay, we'll explain it. I suspect, however, that the sun is 4.5 billion years old. However, given some new and unexpected results to the contrary, and some time for frantic recalculation and theoretical readjustment, I suspect that we could live with Bishop Ussher's value for the age of the earth and sun 4004 BC. I don't think we have much in the way of observational evidence in astronomy to conflict with that. Well, these are pretty candid admissions, don't you think? Well, we don't have any real empirical or scientific evidence, but we just believe it's that case. But without any other evidence, we could easily just go with Bishop Ussher's age of the earth, 4004 BC. Yes, Tommy?
If you think about it, they're proving that life is so complex that they have to have that time.
Yes.
If time is no concern, why don't they say, well, it only took 10,000 years to make where we're at now. But if things are so complex, they're proving it by having to add the time to it.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's like if there's no God, there's no, if life was not so complex, they can say 10,000 years we were here and just go with it. Who's to say if it took 10,000 years or 4 billion years? Because they're saying that they have to add that time because things are so complex. And they know it's so complex, they have to add that time. Or
You
they
could
can just say 10,000 years.
They're hiding in time, aren't they? Literally hiding their theory in time. Well, that's what we're trying to unravel here. When you look at the evidence, and again, we're trying to determine which of the two models for the origin of mankind best fits the scientific facts as we know them. We have two philosophies. And so which of those two philosophies is best supported by scientific fact? And that's really all we can do in either model. And so the scientific evidence points to a young earth. Let's consider the magnetic field, something you don't think about every day, but it's something you rely on every single day of your life and don't realize it. There are three important force fields associated with planet Earth: gravitational, electric, and magnetic. The magnetic field is due to the huge electric current, billions of amperes worth, circulating in the core of the Earth. It is now known that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying faster than any other worldwide geophysical phenomenon. knowledgeable scientists do not debate the fact of the rapid decrease in the Earth's magnetic field. So let's just drive that point home here. This is not something that a creation scientist throws out there and says, hey, why don't y'all accept our worldview because we think that it's decaying. Everybody knows how rapidly the magnetic field is decaying, and it's at a consistent rate. And so we know that. It's a fact. It's observational. It's based on evidence. We know this is occurring. No one disputes this fact. A comprehensive government report estimated, in fact, that the magnetic field would be gone by the year AD 3991. Any of you Star Trek fans, you watch those Star Trek movies? A lot of those Star Trek episodes are based around 39 in 90s and some, late in that particular era. According to this, there won't be a magnetic field around planet Earth to support life at that point. But anyway, using I won't be around by then, but complex mathematical equations to try to calculate backwards, employing a known value for the half-life decay rate of the field, presents a very serious problem in relation to the time needed by evolutionists. Oh, what is that problem? The problem is that going backward for more than just a few thousand years produces an impossibly large value in the magnetic field and of the electrically generated heat stored in the Earth's core. In fact, Dr. Barnes, late professor emeritus of physics at the University of Texas at El Paso, calculated the upper limit of this time span to be 10,000 years. This is one of those scientific facts. And this is not one that's talked about a lot. I mean, it's well known, but it's not talked about a lot. But this is one we really need to camp out on because, again, if we're talking about science, this is one of those unavoidable things. We want to continue living on planet Earth. Well, by 3991, we're not going to be able to continue living on planet Earth because there won't be a magnetic field to support life as we know it. If we go back more than 10,000 years, the Earth would have exploded. It wouldn't be able to hold itself together. There'd be so much heat stored in the Earth's core. So these are simple facts, undeniable facts. We're asking now the question, do we have an Earth that supports billions of years or thousands of years? This is just one of many ways. Going back any further than this, Barnes concluded would cause the field to be at such huge values that the Earth could not sustain itself, would rupture and crack. According to the facts associated with the magnetic field, the upper limit for the age of the Earth is 10,000 years. Here's another thing I want us to consider from Genesis. We're talking about two worldviews, two philosophies, and which of those two philosophies is best supported by known scientific fact? In Genesis 1:11, Moses was inspired by God to write, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth," and it was so. In verse 24, God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind," and it was so. Now, these are just statements found in the book of Genesis. I believe it was Jule Miller that first pointed out, at least to me, many years ago, the Bible is not a science book per se. He's right. It is not a science book. But when it speaks about scientific matters, it always speaks accurately. And we have here a classic case in point. We have a declaration from God, writing through the hand of Moses, that God made everything according to its what? What does that mean? Okay, we would use the term species today, wouldn't we? So everything has a species, our family group. And in that family group, there are various subsects, but they're all part of that same species, right? Going back to the Georgia standards for biology. The basic idea of biological evolution is that the Earth's present-day species developed from earlier, distinctly different species. So I'm just going to ask you to understand what's being stated here, as this is what we're going to teach in our biology classes. So, dogs came from something different. Whales and porpoises came from something very different. Birds came from something very different. Human beings came from something very different. That's what evolutionists want us to believe. This is what they say. And this is what Georgia Standards for Biology Classroom requires, that we understand and that we teach evolution has present-day species developing from earlier, distinctly different species. How many of you know of a dog that's ever given birth to a cat? Or a bird that gave birth to a fish? I mean, have you ever seen anything like that? I mean, who's observed that? Where's the observational evidence that we have different? Well, we're asking questions that we really have an answer to already. We know. And we have God stating it in what, 1500 BC or more? God already told us. He made everything according to its kind. That's a decree by God. It's a physical law that God established. Every living thing produces after its kind. Byron Nelson, author of After Its Kind, offered the following commentary on these statements from Scripture. He said, in the first chapter of Genesis, however, because it is a matter of the greatest religious importance, the Bible speaks clearly and finally on a matter of biology. After its kind is the statement of a biological principle that no human observation has ever known to fail. The most ancient human records engraved on stone or painted on the walls of caves bear witness to the fact that horses have ever been horses, bears have ever been bears, geese have ever been geese, reindeer have ever been reindeer. The most desperate and subtle efforts of man in modern times have been unable to alter this divine decree. The Bible teaches that from the beginning there have been a large number of types of living things, man included, which were so created as to remain true to their particular type throughout all generations. The latest results of modern biological research, Mendel's laws, agree exactly with what was written by Moses 3,000 years ago, and they also elucidate it. He's not saying anything that's out of the ordinary or hard to understand. He's just stating simple fact. We all understand this. We know that dogs give birth to dogs. People give birth to people. We know this. E.B. Ford, in his work Understanding Genetics, made this observation. He said it may seem a platitude to say that the offspring of buttercups, sparrows, and human beings are buttercups, sparrows, and human beings. What then keeps them, and indeed living things in general, on the right lines? Why are there not pairs of sparrows, for instance, that beget robins, or some other species of bird? Why indeed birds at all? Something must be handed on from parent to offspring which ensures conformity, not complete, but in a high degree, and prevents such extreme departures. What is it? How does it work? What rules does it obey? And why does it apparently allow only limited variation? Genetics is the science that endeavors to answer these questions and much else besides. It is the study of organic inheritance and variation, if we must use more formal language. Buttercups give rise to buttercup. Sparrows to sparrows, human beings. Do we all know this? Is there anyone that doesn't know this? Is there an evolutionist that doesn't know this? We all know this. We see it and we observe it and we even understand it, because we understand a great deal more today about genetics than they did just 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. It's amazing how much advance has been made in the field of genetics. But when you go back to Genesis chapter 1, God stated from the very beginning of time, everything will reproduce after its kind. The biologist from the evolutionary camp tells us that we have one thing giving birth to another thing, one species giving rise to another species, something very different over time. I see hands everywhere. Joe?
Yes, as an educator, next year, I know Paulding County, they're going to have to roll out these new or revamped science standards. And so what they've done with every standard is they've changed the verbiage to where the old one would say, for biology, it would say, evaluate the role of natural selection and development of the theory of evolution. So students will evaluate, but now every standard in every grade level is obtain they're going to have to A, construct an explanation of the new understandings of Earth's history, B, analyze and interpret data to explain patterns in biodiversity that result from what you're saying here, speciation, and then C, construct an argument using valid and reliable sources that support this claim that said all living organisms are related by way of common descent. So they're going to have to make an argument. That's going to be their grade as to how they can use research to prove this ridiculous theory.
They're going to have to try to prove that what we're saying here that defies the laws of science and genetics is true. Okay, that's what we're doing.
So they changed it from just studying it, knowing it, putting on a test.
You got to defend it now.
Now they have to actually do something with it.
Yeah. Chris, you had a comment?
The teachers have to do something with it?
They have to teach the students to do it.
You have to teach the students to do that, yeah.
Teach the students to do
You have a comment, Chris? Or?
I was just going back to kind of what you're talking about, and I think it's interesting that we have examples, even now that we know of these, they call them hybrids, interspecies hybrids, where, you know, two animals that are similar can produce a different animal. A mule is a good example. It's a horse and a donkey producing something that's different. But in those cases, those hybrids, invariably, almost 100% of the time, they're sterile.
They don't reproduce.
It's only one generation, and they cannot reproduce and make a mule cannot make another mule. And so, even from the evidence that we see, you know, in those examples, trying to cross those bridges and make something new, you can do it very limitedly, but creation will not allow it to continue any further.
Well, Joe referenced a moment ago in his quote there, natural selection. And that's a phrase that I think Charles Darwin, of course, popularized. And he did this while he was studying at the Galapagos Islands. He was looking at these finches, he was studying birds, and he noticed that certain birds with certain characteristics were able to survive in certain environments. Others that couldn't make the cut, well, they died out. They just didn't survive in that hostile environment. It was not suitable for them, but the birds that could survive there, for whatever reason, they survived. And so he called this the survival of the fittest. But the question remains, how do we explain the arrival of the fittest? And that's what we're not addressing here. It's like we're just ignoring, you know, the bigger question here is, well, where did this fit or non-fit creature come from? We still haven't answered that question. The fact that certain creatures can survive better in certain environments is inarguable. Of course we know that, just like we know dogs always give birth to dogs, etc. We know that some creatures are better adept at certain areas and parts of the world to survive more than others because of certain, you know, features they may have, capabilities they may have, and others will die out. There is that sense of natural selection that has nothing to do with where those creatures, one that survived and one that didn't, came from. So where do we have natural arrival? Where did that come from? We have natural selection, which we can't argue, but we don't have the arrival question. Yes, Tommy?
Go along with what Chris was talking about, you know, even with food, you know, they can genetically change food so it'll grow better and be immune to certain things. But you can't take that seed and plant it to get another seed. You have to go back to the original seed, or they call heirloom seed,
Yeah.
or whatever. You know, so you're right. We can change it somewhat, but it only lasts for just a very short time.
And I would say to you, the reason we can't change it is because the creator of all of these things decreed everything would give birth after its kind. And until we can change that decree by the creator, it's always going to be that way. That's the world that God made. That's the world we live in. It's not going to change. Again, we're talking about two worldviews and which best fits scientific fact. One worldview says that we evolved from other different, very different species. Another says humans have always been humans, and dogs have always been dogs, or canines have always been canines, and felines have always been felines. And I want to say, I don't know why I always think of mosquitoes and ticks in the same thing in my brain as cats. But when I say cat, I think mosquito or tick. or roach. I don't know why these things always seem to, but anyway, all of those things were created in that way originally, and they remain that way and will always be that way. They didn't evolve from different forms. Consider this about the order and complexity of the DNA code. It's so impressive that Dr. Wilder Smith said in A Basis for a New Biology. He said it may be compared to a book or to a video or audio tape with an extra factor coded into enabling the genetic information under certain environmental conditions to read itself and then to execute the information it reads. It resembles, that is, a hypothetical architect's plan of a house, which plan not only contains the information on how to build the house, but which can, when thrown into the garden, build entirely its own initiative, the house, all on its own without the need for contractors or other outside building agents. Such a plan could, when thrown into the garden, build the house, providing it finds the correct conditions and energy supply for the internal contractors who build the house. It does this construction work entirely autonomously, working on the pure information which it contains. Thus, it is fair to say that the technology exhibited by the genetic code is higher than any technology man has until now developed. What is its secret? The secret lies in its ability to store and to execute incredible magnitudes of conceptual information in the ultimate molecular miniaturization of the information storage and retrieval system of the nucleotides and their sequences. Consider this from Darrell Couch, in The Origin of Living Things. The DNA molecule is something utterly unique and had to have an unnatural or supernatural origin. The information in the DNA molecule had to have been imposed upon it by some outside source, just as music is imposed on a cassette tape. The information in DNA is presented in coded form, as explained previously, and codes are not known to arise spontaneously. How about this from Dr. Smith? And I'm having to hurry here because our time is running short. When we're confronted with the genetic code, we are astounded at once at its simplicity, complexity, and the mass of information contained in it. One cannot avoid being awed at the sheer density of information contained in such a miniaturized space. When one considers that the entire chemical information required to construct a man, elephant, frog, or an orchid was compressed into 2 minuscule reproductive cells, one can only be astounded. Only a subhuman could not be astounded. The almost inconceivably complex information needed to synthesize a man, plant, or a crocodile from air, sunlight, organic substances, carbon dioxide, and minerals is contained in these 2 tiny cells. If one were to request an engineer to accomplish this feat of information miniaturization, one would be considered fit for the psychiatric line. To maintain that it all arose by chance and non-planning is to deny human common sense. Pole has become anti-pole. The almost unimaginable complexity of the information on the genetic code, along with the simplicity of its concept, 4 letters made of simple chemical molecules, together with its extreme compactness, imply an inconceivably high intelligence behind it. Present-day information theory permits no other interpretation of the facts of the genetic code. I thought lightning struck mud billions of years ago and spontaneously generated life, and here we are talking about it. I mean, when you think about the 2 worldviews I've been discussing in class, which of those 2 worldviews fits scientific fact? We're not talking about theories. We're talking about simple scientific fact. The Hebrew writer said it this way: every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. When you walked into this building tonight, you didn't assume it just was constructed from an explosion. You know that there was planning, there was engineering, there was thought, purpose behind it. You may not agree with its construction. You may say you could have done this or that different, maybe, but be that as it may, you know this didn't just construct itself. But this building is so simple in its design and its structure in comparison to just one of your body parts. And the function of consider the eye or the ear or your nose or your lungs. Consider any part of your body, how complex, the nervous system, the muscular system. I mean, just consider these things, how they work, how they orchestrate together to make us into functioning human beings. And say it all just happened over time and by chance. It's just absurd. Now, you may say, I don't believe in God still. Fine. you don't have to believe in the God of the Bible. But I'm simply suggesting that we really can't use our brain and be honest with the facts and accept Darwinian style evolution. It just doesn't address reality. It just doesn't. I mean, people can say, we saw the quote tonight. Well, we don't have anything in observational evidence to support 4.6 billion years old, but we believe it anyway. What was that doctor that said back in the 50s, we know that spontaneous generation is not possible, but here we are, therefore I believe spontaneous generation. And we're accused of burying our heads in the sand. Dr. Randy Pierce said it like this: once people understand how incredibly complex the genetic makeup of the human being is and the amazing way that information is translated into a functioning human, this surely points to a creator. And all I can say is amen to that. Yes, Tommy?
And it goes back to what I said earlier. They know that. They know it. That's why they have to add billions of years to it, because they know it's complex. Because if there's no God, or no, like I said, they can say it was only 10,000 years that we created here on Earth. And that would be true if there's no God. Because, there's no times we can look at it scientifically.
But they would say to you, you're choosing to believe in God. Have you ever seen God? Have you ever talked with God? Has he ever introduced himself to you? So why do you believe in God? It's a valid question, and it's one that we should be able to address. But they believe in time. I believe in God. They believe, honestly, that time, given enough of it, but here's the thing about that, and this is what I want to point out, if I don't say anything else. There's this perception that the Darwinists have science on their side, that they're coming and approaching this thing from a purely scientific standpoint. But when it comes to the question of time itself, they are literally hiding behind time. Because they realize, and you're right, Tommy, if you have enough time, well, you find relative safety in that. I mean, who's to say what happened 15 billion years ago? That's right. Who's to say what happened 15 billion? Well, if you're talking about observational, empirical evidence, observable evidence, if that's what we're talking about, you would have to admit there's nothing we can observe and see scientifically today to support Darwin's view. But let's just get away from reality for a moment. Let's go back into time. Fine, do that. That's philosophy. That's not science. And it's a philosophy, in my opinion, that's based on nonsense. It's based on data and information that contradicts the laws of science. There are many people that choose to believe it that way. They know they can't prove it scientifically, but again, I just don't want any of the members of this church ever to be intimidated by someone who says, you go out there on a leap of faith and just want to believe in God because it makes you feel good. No, I believe the evidence supports my worldview. And I believe the evidence does not support your worldview. So I believe that I have more scientific ground to stand on than you do. No, I'm not saying I can scientifically prove creation any more than you can scientifically prove the Big Bang. But I do believe that my worldview is based on and supported by scientific evidence, and it's not in the Darwinist camp. Any thoughts or comments? We got about 30 seconds, I think. Yes, sir?
I learned a not so pleasant lesson. My son-in-law heard me talking about some deer corn. He said, well, I'll bring you some. I think he probably mentioned not to plant it, but I went ahead and planted it anyway. It grew about 4 to 5 feet tall and looking real good, but it never made any ears of corn. It's been genetically modified for production. So, and then another thing,
Oh, deer corn you got. Okay.
yeah, that's what he wanted me to use it for, and I did. But the second thing, Published Press, they were advertising the debate between Brother Thomas More and the atheist Anthony Flew. They got a good deal on that debate right now.
That's a very, very good debate. My brother actually got to attend that debate years ago.
Anthony Flew now say DNA is fit him, there is a creator.
Yeah, Anthony Blue has switched positions over the years. That's profound. I think Dr. Warren helped to send him in that direction as well. That was a good debate. Number 812. I'm going to sleep. How's Goodley? How's Avery doing? She at home recovering? She had her tonsil taken out yesterday, and so she's not here with us tonight. Lydia is not with us tonight. Not sure what her excuse is, other than she gave birth to a baby boy today. We're very proud to announce the arrival of James Matthew. I don't know why she's waiting to come to church. It was this morning. She looked fine when I left her at the hospital. But anyway, I want to congratulate Lydia and I guess Jordan too. And Larry is here. And I know that's an exciting time for all of us. Very thankful for these arrivals. Congratulations again to both families. Youth devotional this coming Sunday at the home of Scott and Emily Wilson starting at 5 o'clock. There's going to be a pantry unloading next Tuesday around 11:30. If you could help at the church building, we could use you to help us unload the food that's coming from Midwest Food Bank. Also, don't forget, ladies, your night out on Thursday, September the 8th at the American Pie Pizzeria in Carrollton. Also, in the Gold Rush Parade, we still need volunteers to help in the booth, I believe at 10 o'clock. Joe, isn't that right? And we also need some to come help in the morning at 6 o'clock to get set up. So if you can do that, please sign the list on the table in the foyer. Don't forget, our gospel meeting starts 1 week from this Sunday. The mail-out went out in the mail yesterday, and so we're excited about that. And we're asking you to go ahead and help herald this great event. Brother Roy Johnson will be speaking for us during our gospel meeting. That will be Sunday week. And also we will be feeding the preacher during that week using the various groups. And when we give names to the groups, then you'll know which group you are and we'll get you established in that. Right now you're just A, B, C, and D, but you don't know which group that is. So we'll have to make that a little clearer for you. But anyway, we will be feeding the preacher. Also having a fellowship meal following the morning worship that day. Any other announcements we need to make tonight? Anyone on our prayer list we need to mention? Number 812 will be the song of invitation that's been announced. We're talking in our adult class tonight about two worldviews. Whether or not there is a God, or whether or not we are simply here as a product of biological evolution. It really makes all the difference in the world as to how we live our lives and what we think about our lives and how we conduct our lives and what is the meaning of our life and what is the end of our life. And when you stop and think about your life, you really need to ask, if I died tonight, if I died this next week, if I died in the next year, is that the end of me? Is that all there is? Or is there something beyond this life? Of course, we know that there is a God. We know that His Word has been revealed to us, has taught us and instructed us. There is something beyond this life. There's a heaven to gain, and there is a hell to shun. And for those who are willing to pay the sacrifice and live the life that God has called us to live, we will have the abundant life here, yes, but we'll have eternal life in the hereafter. For those who choose to live their own life and do their own thing, you may be happy for a day or two, you may be pleasured for a day or two, but in the end, ultimate ruin. And what a waste for your life. It doesn't have to be so. God has made a way for us. Even when we have wandered from his way and have failed him, as we all have, there is a way home. And that way is through the blood of his Son. Through gospel obedience, or being reconciled to our rightful place if we've wandered from the faith. If we can help you to make things right with God tonight, if we can assist you, please don't hesitate to make that need known while together we stand as we sing.
All things are ready.